So what I have found in terms of vascular surgery around the world is that we have developed ourselves systematically into a thinking system. It is based on systems thinking, the way that the various specialties interface at the nexi of the dovetailing, of the converging of what they do. And if you think of it, there is a kind of a cyclic or annular or radial, or maybe even circumlocutory way of looking at medicine. And we have, of course, the patients, we have the general practitioners, and we have the specialists, kind of wholesaling and retailing. And what I'd like to think of is that the first resource that goes into this thinking system is human resources, also known as people. The second resource, of course, has to be financial resources. And things are a bit skimpy at the moment in Australia. I understand you used to be almost a whole dollar, but now it's down to 65 cents. I'm sorry about that. I hope I'm not being too patronizing or pompous or bombastic or supercilious, and just trying to be constructive and productive. In fact, one of the things we do in vascular surgery is increase productivity, because productivity is the quotient of output over input, and when you've got that equation, there's only two ways you can go. That is, for the same input you get more output, or the initial output requires less input. I don't know, David, where do you stand on that? Anyway, that's another story. The next resource in vascular surgery, which is crucial, of course, is the physical resources of our equipment. And thank you so much to our sponsors. I was speaking to Bjorn again from Abbott, and thank you, Bjorn, for your support. He's a platinum sponsor. Anything on the table that is platinum, you can take away with you. He's sponsored it. Anything that's stainless steel, you can't. Of course, a resource is the natural resources, such as this beautiful environment in Australia in which we find ourselves, and time. Very important for medicine, almost as important as it is for law, although we don't measure out time in 6-minute lots. Time is the ultimate finite resource, which is either a denominator or a numerator, depending on where you did your math or maths. And because we are a pluralistic society these days, and pluralism is rife, and that's a good thing. And taking that multicultural metaphor one step further, you know, the snake in Taoist philosophy, or the dragon in Hindu theology, which is impossibly swallowing its own tail so that it becomes an increasingly concentric circle. Excuse me, my English is not so good, so I'm doing the best I can. Well, in the same way as a sort of endlessly self-calibrating feedback loop, this system, this thinking system for specialist referrals and for cardiovascular work and for, as you say in your conference title, vascular interventions, is in fact part of its own input. And those inputs, those resources are input as input and then as throughput. I like to transform them into output, the outcome from which is useful to measure initially qualitatively and ultimately quantitatively against a plethora of hierarchies and aggregation of continua and a collection of assessment criteria before feeding them back into this system as both a refined input and a submission to potential sponsors for further support. But I commend to you the nature of this particular idea for vascular interventions, based as it is on a precept, which in a Florida hospital I worked at recently was ameliorated from a precept into a concept, enhanced a little bit further with some excellent vascular intervention into an idea, and from thence it became a model which we represented initially two-dimensionally with X and Y axes and 4 quadrants, before exploding it into a 3-dimensional Rubik's Cube type dice manifestation of the same, and pushed it out the other side as a shifted paradigm. And this is where it becomes interesting for specialists such as us. How does the shifted paradigm on the one hand connect to and relate with the thinking system based on systems thinking on the other, which by the way is systemic, systematic and systematized? Well, we got some bright young, I suppose you would call them doctoral students here. And they developed some theoretical and hypothetical, simultaneously converging and diverging parallel lines to interconnect the various component parts in a kind of fusion, a sort of a gestalt, so that they could be integrated and synthesized into an holistic totality which contextualizes the content, because content without context has no meaning, and vascular surgeons like to be lucid and articulate rather than facile and gratuitous. I mentioned all this before I begin, so that we have the same lexicon of keywords, the same thesaurus of jargon and cliches, and the same linguistic wastepaper basket in which to dip. One of the first tenets in the Hippocratic Oath is from the outset, do no harm. But I like the idea of values, because values, you know, often in Australia, not just medically, or maybe not even medically, but in Australia I think values have been known as an optional extra. But I commend to you the nature of values, because they can circumscribe and inform a sense of vision, which is a light on the hill, like a lighthouse, metaphorically. And so we go from values to vision, and then once we have the vision right in our hospital system and our medical fraternity, we can then go to mission, which is the fire in the belly, the thing that is either intrinsically motivating or extrinsically motivating. Of course, if you've got continual fire in your belly, you should see a registered medical practitioner. Now, I like to think of intrinsic motivation as job enrichment, job enhancement, job rotation, something that relieves the tedium of monotony. And I'd like to think of extrinsic motivation as money, prestige, and power. And as I move through my career and upgrade my vehicles from what is off-cast from the Eastern Bloc through to the nicer new cars from the Western Bloc, I am moving from intrinsic motivation to extrinsic motivation. And of course, then there is a bit of strategy. Why would someone come to your hospital, to your clinic, to your surgery, vis-a-vis someone else's? What is it that you can give that they can't? In the whole continuum from charming, gracious, cordial, to anesthetists, where are vascular surgeons, and do we have an image problem? Do we prefer to work with people when they are under the influence of some sort of drug? And what effect does this have on us in our outside life? I know a number of my fellow vascular surgeons in Florida are using the drug-coated balloons as a kind of a clowning activity on the weekend. And they're going not to children's parties, but to fraternity parties, and making little animals, and then waking up 3 days later. It's a bit of a challenge. Sometimes there is a bit of a relationship that could be had between doctors and nurses that leads to marriage, and that's a bad thing. We have in my hospital assisted divorce for some liaisons, because when you go home, then they're still playing doctors and nurses, you see, and the roles need to be reversed. Well, I'm about a quarter of the way through my notes here, and you know, this is something I have learned from the dean of my faculty of medicine at my hospital, who sent me to a remedial presentation skills course. He said, "You don't know how to speak. People are bored by what you say. You're chatty, loquacious, verbose, garrulous, and prolix. You need to be pithy." So I've tried to be pithy, which is very hard in Spanish. But fortunately, I'm bilingual in Spanish and Portuguese. I can be silent in both languages. Actually, that is a Swedish-Danish joke, and I tried it on our friend Bjorn again from Abbott, and he didn't think it was funny either. So